all about the aerial spraying that was happening. So she starts off by talking about the aerial spraying of DDT. Just so you know, DDT, dichloryl lanthanol trichloroethane, is a pesticide which is a synthetic chemical compound and is a colorless crystalline solid. And aerial spraying is done by sprayers containing the pesticide or the chemical that's being sprayed attached to airplanes. So you can kind of see that in the picture. It just flies and lots of chemicals fall out. It's a wonderful sight. In her book, Carson said that not only the target insect or plant, but anything human or non-human within the range of the chemical fallout may know the sinister touch of the poison. Not only forests and cultivated fields are sprayed, but towns and cities as well. So everything in range of what's being sprayed gets sprayed with the chemicals. And she also said because the spray planes were paid by the gallon rather than by the acre, there was no effort to be conservative, and many properties were sprayed not once but several times.
And one of the first pests they were trying to control with these aerial sprayings were the gypsy moths. And the gypsy moth has been in the U.S. for nearly 100 years. And Leopold Trouvelot, a French scientist, accidentally allowed a few to escape from his lab in Massachusetts. So gypsy moths in their larval stage attack the foliage of oak trees and a few other hardwoods for a few weeks each spring. And that picture over there is larva. And the agricultural department was afraid that the gypsy moth would invade the great hardwood forest of the Southern Appalachians. So then the Plant Pest Control Division called for a blanket spraying of several million acres a year with the intention of eradicating the gypsy moths in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Michigan, and New York.
So in 1956, they sprayed nearly 1 million acres in those states, and when they sprayed New York, they sprayed in the city, despite the fact that gypsy moths don't inhabit the cities because there's not many trees there. And it also doesn't live in meadows, cultivated fields, gardens, or marshes, but they sprayed there. They also sprayed truck gardens, dairy farms, fish ponds, salt marshes, and they have sprayed in the suburbs. So mostly they sprayed places where the gypsy moth wasn't even a problem. Carson said that automobiles were spotted with the oily mixture, flowers and shrubs were ruined, birds, fish, crabs, and useful insects were killed. The spraying also resulted in contaminated milk and farm produce because the cows would graze on the grass that had been sprayed, and so the DDT would get in them and the milk would be contaminated then. Beekeepers also suffered from the DDT spraying because it completely or mostly completely wiped out the beekeepers' colonies.
The next pest they tried to treat with blanket spraying was the fire ant. And the fire ant entered the United States from South America through the port of Mobile, Alabama, and it was discovered shortly after World War I. It's considered a nuisance because it builds very large nests or mounds, usually a foot or more high, which disrupts the operation of the farm equipment. But only 2 states listed it among their 20 top insect pests, so it really was not a concern to crops or livestock. So the threat of the fire ant was blown completely out of proportion by the government. They had publicity campaigns and government releases, motion pictures, and government-inspired stories portraying the fire ant as a despoiler of southern agriculture and a killer of birds, livestock.
The agriculture department advertised that the fire ant was really dangerous to humans because of its sting, but it does sting, but it's not really painful. It's compared to like a sting from a bee or a wasp, so it's not like something that many people would die from if they got stung. The blanket spraying in massive areas was pretty unnecessary because the treatment of the fire ants' mounds could be handled individually, and that picture in the center is what the fire ant mound looks like. They can get pretty big, which is why people call it a nuisance, but spraying massive areas is not really the way to solve that. Instead of using DDT to spray, they used two much more toxic chemicals, dieldrin and heptachlor, and they were new chemicals at the time, and there was little knowledge of what the effects would be. Dieldrin is an alternative to DDT DDT is a very persistent chemical that stays within the food chain, and it does not easily break down, and it stays within the tissues of humans and animals. And heptachlor is similar to dieldrin. It's also a persistent pesticide that stays in the environment for decades, and it becomes more toxic over a short time. Of those two chemicals, they used 2 pounds to the acre, which it was heavier than the normal dosage of DDT. And just so you have perspective, if they used 20 pounds of DDT to the acre, they used 120 pounds of dieldrin.
So the campaign for the fire ants was launched in 1958, and they sprayed 1 million acres in the first year. In Texas, possums, armadillos, and nearly the entire raccoon population disappeared after the chemicals were sprayed. And one of the biggest effects was birds. They found a lot of dead birds in Texas, Louisiana, Alabama, Georgia, and Florida. And after they analyzed them, they found more than 90% of them had dieldrin or heptachlor in their system. So this included blackbirds, meadowlarks, woodcocks, the bobwhite quail, turkeys, and all the songbirds. They were seriously reduced and affected by the sprayings. And in addition to birds, there was livestock, poultry, and household pets that were also reduced. And if any animal was not affected immediately by the sprayings, they would suffer usually within a period of 2 weeks. Many suffered from a fatal disease of the nervous system, and this happened through contaminated food and water. And cows were severely affected by the sprayings because heptachlor was often found in the fields and croplands where they grazed. So if the cows ate the poison, it would show up in their milk, which was a serious concern.
Another example of aerial spraying that we found that happened recently was the spraying of the light brown apple moth in 2008 in California. This moth is not a huge threat similar to the gypsy moth and the red ant. It's managed naturally by predation and parasitoids. The moth is considered to be a simple leaf roller. The larva rolls the leaf that it's been living and feeding on since its larval stage to create a cocoon, and it matures into a caterpillar from there and then to a moth. In general, the larvae cause superficial damage to plants and tend not to accumulate on any one plant due to close non-selectivity as well as predation by other insects. There are other moths, particularly in California, that cause much more damage than the leaf roller.
And after the spraying of an unknown chemical mixture in 2008 in California, hundreds of people reported that they felt sick. So we have a little video about this. When they sprayed, it just covered everything. And what they were spraying was a pheromone chemical mixture, which was seen as a safer alternative to toxic chemical sprays, but it's still considered a pesticide and still has harmful effects on the environment. And the warning label on the pesticide clearly states hazard to humans and domestic animals. Harmful if absorbed through the skin. Causes moderate eye irritation. Avoid contact with skin or eyes or clothing. Harmful if inhaled. Avoid breathing vapor or spray mist. Environmental hazard do not apply to water or areas where surface water is present. So that's clearly a red flag.
So after reading the chapter and researching, kind of came to the conclusion that aerial spraying is really not that great of an idea to get rid of pests, especially because most of the pests that she talked about in the chapter and in our research weren't like big threats and could be handled like individually. And the toxic chemicals get everywhere, and it affects plants, animals, and humans, and it does more harm than it does good. It's better to target specific areas rather than doing huge blanket sprayings of areas where the pests don't even reside, especially when they're not deemed as